All right. Thank you very much for inviting me, ladies and gentlemen. It's a pleasure to talk to you. And first of all, let me just say that these are my views and opinions. It's not the University of Edinburgh that I'm representing today, which doesn't mean that it's necessarily contradictory. The second preliminary remark that I would like to make is that my job here, or what I'm going to do in the next 10 minutes or so, is to present an analytical, conceptual framework based on the experiences that we have seen in Western Europe, in the EU 15 over the last couple of decades. But apparently, it's up to you guys, experts on the ground, to make this work for you, or make parts of it work for you if you think it's useful at all. Oh, does that work? Okay, thank you. So the first question that we need to ask when we talk about minority parties is basically what makes this group of parties, this party family, different from any other political party or any other group of political parties. And I think that the most convincing answer to that is actually their origin. So Lipset and Rockin already back in the 1960s stated that these parties came into being as a result of a center-periphery cleavage. So these parties were created because they opposed the integration of certain territories into the nation states that have been created or that were created in the 19th century. So I put a map of Spain up here, but you can basically put any other country in Western Europe on there, and you will see that there is some resistance at the edges of these newly emerging states against the cultural, economic, or political integration of these territories into newly emerging states. Okay, of course. Okay. So basically, minority parties is not the only term that has been used to refer to this group of parties, but in the literature we also see references to regionalist parties, ethnic parties. We have already spoken about the fact that there are some slight differences between those, but in general, all these labels refer to a group of parties that basically came into being as a result of the center-periphery cleavage. Can we skip the next slide, please, and then go straight to the... Okay, yeah, the next one. Okay, sorry about that. So, having established that these parties basically share their common origin, this is actually where the communality stops, because there's a huge variety between what these parties actually want and how they want to defend the particularities of their regions. So the first distinction that we can make when we talk about these parties' goals is basically whether they want either independence for their region or whether they are looking for some sort of accommodation within the region. Or whether they're looking for some sort of accommodation within within the state of which they're currently a part of. So either in the form of autonomy, federalism, or any other sort of internal arrangements. When we look at secessionist parties, we can basically make a differentiation between parties that want to establish a independent country and parties that want their region to break away from their country and then have their region integrated into another state. So those would then be irredentist parties. Next slide, please. Yeah, that's it. So having established this differentiation between secessionism and accommodationism, what we very often see is that there is some sort of ambiguity. Parties very often say that they want, for instance, the greatest possible extent of self-government. So what does that mean? they play with this ambiguity very frequently because it is useful for them to attract the largest possible share of votes, but it is also helpful for them because it helps them to get more bargaining power when they negotiate with the central state. Because obviously when you say all options are on the table, the state is probably willing to give you more than when you say this is just this tiny fraction of autonomous powers that we want. The second distinction, can we go back please? The second distinction would then be protectionism versus autonomism, which would basically mean that protectionism is the, back please. Which would, the protectionism would be that these parties want to keep or want to preserve their particularities within their region. So they would like to see their own minority language schools, for instance, but they are not very keen on having autonomous legislative powers. Autonomous parties, on the other hand, are more extreme. They go beyond that, and they want to have their own legislative powers without the infringement of the central state. The third distinction that we can make is between asymmetry and symmetric arrangements. Some parties, like the main Catalan parties or the parties in the Basque country, they would never accept that their region is one part out of many within a federal state. They will always push for slightly more concessions because they want their region to be special within the country of which they are a part. Other parties, however, like the CSU in Bavaria, in Germany for instance, is very happy to accept a certain degree of autonomy for their region, and they are also happy that those powers are given to other regions as well. And then, of course, it makes a huge qualitative difference whether parties adhere only to constitutional and peaceful principles, or, as has been unfortunately the case for many decades in Northern Ireland or the Basque country, when parties are in some way or the other associated with violent militant groups and actually consider violence to be a legitimate form of pushing for their policy goals. Okay, next please. So going beyond this these core demands of these parties, there is also a lot of diversity on other issue dimensions. So we have a lot of, next please. So we see a lot of differentiation on the center-left and center-right dimension. Most regionalist and minority parties gather somewhere in the center, on the center-right or the center-left. But we see also parties on the far left or on the far right dimension. Next, please. We also do that. We also see this divergence or this variety on the what has been called the cultural left-right dimension when it comes to multiculturalism or environmental protection. And next, please. We also see a lot of diversity when it comes to positions on the European Union. The pattern there is that centralist parties, so parties on the center-left and the center-right, tend to be more pro-European, whereas parties on the ideological fringes, on the far right and on the far left, tend to be rather Eurosceptic. Next, please. Okay, so that's what I just said. Next, please. Okay, so having established that the group of minority parties is very diverse and very and demands a lot of different things. The first statement that we can make when we look at whether these parties are successful or not is that it depends on what they want and how we measure success. And I think the first or the most useful approach is to differentiate a party's success into three different dimensions. So parties can either be vote seekers, which means that they want to attract the greatest possible number of votes. They can either be office seekers, which means they want to be elected into government, or they can be policy seekers, which means that predominantly want to have their policies, the issues that they really demand implemented. Of course, it's nice for a party to be successful on all three dimensions, but it is very often a trade-off. And then, of course, when we look at regional or minority parties, it also depends on where do we measure success. Obviously, for statewide national parties, the central state or the national state is basically the main arena for the implementation of their policies. But regional parties very often put a bigger focus on the regional sub-state level. And then, of course, we also have the supra-state level, namely the European Union, and the local level, the municipalities. Next slide, please. Next, please. One more. Okay. So when we look at parties as vote seekers, when are parties successful when they try to attract the greatest possible number of votes? The differentiation that we have to make there is whether these parties either compete only within their own ethnic bloc, which would, for example, be the case in South Tyrol, where the German-speaking minority in Italy only where the parties that want to represent the German-speaking minority in Italy only compete against other German parties, or there are parties that have to maneuver through conditions of what we call dual voting, which means that they compete with other national parties. So the Scottish National Party, for instance, has to compete with other statewide parties because their constituencies are not so fixed. Many people vote the Scottish National Party on one occasion, but they vote the Labour Party, which is obviously a UK-wide party, in other instances. So it's useful to make this differentiation between dual and ethnic voting, but we have seen successful parties in either categories. Next step, please. So when we look at policies, it does, of course, crucially depend on what these parties demand, but it does also make a difference whether these parties are in government or not. And when we look at parties in government, we also have to ask ourselves, are they in a coalition or is it a single-party government? In some regions, like in South Tyrol or in Northern Ireland, we have power-sharing arrangements in place where minority parties have to go into coalitions with parties that represent the majority population. So obviously that requires many more concessions to be made, and it does not give them necessarily the upper hand when it comes to the implementation of policies at the regional level. But of course, the regional level is not the only level of government where policies are being implemented. The national level is very crucial as well, and there, of course, size matters. Catalonia is a relatively big region in Spain, so they have a lot of members of parliament in the central government, and this is why the Catalan parties on very many occasions have backed minority governments in Madrid, which helped them tremendously to have their policies implemented at the state level as well. So the abolition of conscription, of the mandatory military service, was a key demand of the Catalan parties, and they got that because they supported the conservative government in Madrid back in the 90s. And then, of course, when we look at the supranational level, there are also opportunities like in the Committee of the Regions or the European Parliament, where minority nationalist parties, regionalist parties, can have a say and potentially push their policies forward. Next step, please. And finally, when we look at parties as office seekers, we of course have to ask ourselves, which level of government do they consider to be legitimate? Are they actually willing to go into government at the state level, or do they not consider participation in statewide government to be attractive, because after all, the region is where they actually come from and which creates their raison d'etre. So in very many occasions, we actually see that these parties consider the regional level to be the core of their policies, office, and also vote-seeking efforts. Thank you very much.